We're going to start the third session now. My name is Glaudine Mtshali from the Harvard Global Health Institute. This session will deal with reporting and disclosure. The intention behind company rating is to uncover and disclose certain kinds of information about a company's practices to the public in the hope that this would more closely link the company's reputation to its true practices, and thereby motivate companies to strive to meet mutually beneficial goals, both for the society at large and, of course, for their own bottom line. We have an impressive panel. You can read all about them in your bio sheets, but in essence, we've got 4 professors. Archon Fung, who will start off, is from the Kennedy School. He will walk us through the fundamental mechanics of rating, telling us what really makes transparency work. He'll be followed by Professor Sunita and Professor Larry Lessig, who will raise a complication, which is that, in fact, both disclosure and transparency can and have counterproductive elements inherent in them. I do have to say that Professor Lessig is a very distinguished person. He is the director of the Safra Center for Ethics, and it was in fact his original idea that gave birth to this conference. And Dr. Sa is a fellow at the Safra Center. She's visiting there. Our last speaker will be Paul Stern. He'll discuss what the experience is of rating companies for their impact on the environment, those companies that are already being rated for their experience in environmental issues, and he'll indicate to us how perhaps we can learn lessons from both of these experiences. So without much ado, I'm going to start asking Professor Fung to come to the podium, and to ask that when we open for the Q&A session, all speakers, please remember to press the button. And for those ones who want to ask questions, please use the nearest microphone to you, either around the table or the lone standing one. Professor Fung?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Since we have only a few minutes, I'm going to use those 3 minutes just to talk through 3 different examples of transparency for accountability and for organizational performance that do not come from the health field, that are somewhat older or that we have a little bit more knowledge about, so that we can kind of join in a conversation about reasoning by analogy. The first example comes from LA, and this is the LA restaurant report card example, which I think is rightly one of the best stories about transparency that we have. A while ago, so this one actually is about public health. The LA County decided to require every restaurant to post on its front window a letter grade, A, B, or C, describing the results of the health and safety inspection of that restaurant. This rating system has had, in my view, remarkable effects in terms of both improving the restaurant kitchen hygiene all over LA, and even, according to econometric studies, reducing the instances of hospitalization for foodborne illness. So this is a transparency system that works, where many, many others do not. This is a simple way of thinking about what separates transparency systems that work from those that do not, that comes from a book that Mary Graham and David Weil and I wrote a little while ago called Full Disclosure. And the idea that we call this our action cycle, and it's a very simple idea. And the idea is that if you're in the business of transparency, whether it's public sector transparency or private sector transparency, you have to be able to tell yourself a compelling story about why the information that you're providing will successfully flow through all of the boxes and links in this chain, right? And so just very, very quickly, transparency begins when somebody requires an organization, we call that organization the discloser, to reveal information that it wouldn't otherwise reveal. And that information, the first step in the transparency action cycle is that that information has to enter somebody's calculus that has some audience, some set of users, and it has to enter in a set of calculations that advance those users' values. Do I want to get sick when I eat this taco, right? And then the second step is the user has to be able to act on that information meaningfully. Can I go to a different restaurant where I won't get sick or be less likely to get sick? And then finally, the second half of the action cycle is about the responses, if any, of the disclosures. Do the disclosures care at all that users are behaving the way that they're behaving in response to the information? Restaurant owners care a lot, probably more than they care about public health office fines about whether or not people go to their restaurants, and that's why the LA restaurant report card system is extremely effective, is because it flows through all of the links in this chain of our action cycle here. Now, a huge difference between LA restaurant report card disclosure and the kinds of disclosure that we're talking about here is that the LA restaurant report card satisfies individual consumer values at the individual level, right? Whereas the company global health report card issue that we're talking about today and many others are not so much about consumer values, but trying to enforce accountability on some set of organizations. And that is a much more difficult and challenging proposition for any transparency effort because primarily because it must overcome a collective action problem that the LA restaurant report card example doesn't have to overcome. So if you remember, right after the stimulus, one of the Obama administration's largest transparency efforts was to put all of that contracting information that was part of the X $100 billion stimulus package online on recovery.gov. Now, in my view, that was not a very successful transparency system because very few users had an incentive to go and download the files and dig through all of the information and try to find some company cheating Americans out of their tax dollars. As a matter of fact, most people who went to recovery.gov were not seeking to enforce accountability on the federal government, but simply looking for a job, and they were misinformed about what that transparency website was about, right? Now, one that's a little bit closer, my third example here, and I think I'll be actually way under time, which I think is a good thing. The third example here is also one that deals with public health issues, actually, the toxics release inventory. And this is a comprehensive database of manufacturing and other industrial facilities all over the United States, managed by the Environmental Protection Agency, established since 1988. And it requires every facility above a certain size in the United States to report all of the volumes and amounts of chemicals that are on a certain list to a public database. And that public database is available for everybody to look at. You can go to this website, type in your zip code, and a map will pop up with all of the TRI reporting sites. You can click on a factory and figure out how much of what the volumes and amounts of toxins that are being released into the air or being shipped off are, right? The toxics release inventory. Many journalists and many others have used this, the TRI, to compile lists of worst performers, like, you know, whatever, the worst toxic polluters in Norfolk County or whatever it is. And so it's been a rich resource for them. Now, interestingly, the TRI, lessons from the TRI on the user side are interesting. Journalists have proved to be a big user of TRI. Company managers have proved to be a big user of TRI. It turned out, before the TRI, a bunch of managers just didn't know, were inattentive to the volumes of toxins being released. This created a scorecard that they happened to care about for a bunch of reasons, and some of them acted on TRI information to try to get their company to perform better in terms of toxics releases. Environmental organizations, who you think would be the obvious actor interested in using TRI information, were for the most part not there. The EDF for a while supported scorecard, which was a data processing kind of thing, but compared to other accountability organizations, environmental organizations were not large users of the TRI, and it's interesting to think about why. And so in the topic under discussion today, global health, you think, well, maybe global health activists and activist organizations might be some of the prime users in a naming and shaming dynamic. And we can, I'd love to engage in a conversation about whether or not that's likely to be the case. Thank you very much. So I did use all my time.
Hello, I'm Sunita from Georgetown University. I'm delighted to be here today. Now, much of my current and prior research has looked at disclosure, specifically disclosure of conflicts of interest, in that what's good for a particular advisor or provider might be not so good for a consumer. And one of the main ways to manage such conflicts of interest is to have people tell us about them. In other words, they disclose. And what I look at is specifically whether disclosure is an effective fix to managing conflicts of interest, and some of the unintended consequences of disclosure. And specifically today, I want to talk about whether disclosure or transparency can motivate providers to give more value to consumers or to reject conflicts of interest. And even though my research focuses very much on the disclosures of conflicts of interest, it can be applied more generally to other types of disclosures, such as other health and safety or pollution indices or a global health rating. So disclosure is really popular across many different industries and sectors, and there's a rational economic reason for this. Disclosure, at least in theory, provides potentially useful information. So it decreases that information gap between advisors and advisees, so that advisees, consumers, can make informed choices. And one of the ways that consumers can react to disclosure is they decide to discount advice or recommendations that comes with disclosure of a conflict of interest or information that they don't like. Another way that they could react would be to shift their business elsewhere, go and see an unconflicted provider. However, prior research has shown that there's limitations to this logic. So consumers often don't know how to react to disclosure information, particularly complicated disclosure information. So disclosure of a conflict of interest is hard to interpret. So consumers end up really just ignoring it, or if they decide to discount for it, they discount insufficiently, either due to anchoring effects or because they don't know how much to discount, so they discount erratically. And also, prior research has shown that most people don't shift to other providers. They don't seek second opinions for a variety of reasons, such as cost and time, not wishing to delay a decision. So in some circumstances, disclosure doesn't seem to work so well on consumers. And so I wondered whether disclosure works better on providers or advisors. And one way that disclosure could work well is if advisors practice strategic restraint. That is, that they rein in the bias in their advice due to fear that the disclosure is going to bring extra scrutiny to that advice. Again, prior research shows that this often doesn't happen. So advisors who are subject to a conflict of interest end up given even more biased advice with disclosure than without disclosure. And that's in part because they strategically exaggerate to offset anticipated discounting by the audience, and also in part because they feel morally licensed to give more biased advice once they've been honest with their disclosure. And for individual advisors, disclosure is really attractive because it could relieve any feelings of guilt or personal responsibility that may occur. And for companies, it could limit liability, much as we saw with warnings on cigarette packets. However, much of the prior research on disclosure of conflicts of interest on advisors focused on this static situation where advisors were subject to a conflict of interest that they couldn't avoid. However, in many situations, advisors do have a choice. Companies have a choice whether to accept or reject a conflict of interest, where to invest their money, whether to launch a particular product. And in these situations, I was wanted to investigate whether disclosure actually motivates providers to avoid conflicts of interest so they can declare that they have nothing to disclose except the absence of conflicts. So does it become a deterrent to accepting conflicts of interest? And I wanted to have a look at this in more detail. And so with George Lowenstein, we conducted 3 experiments to really examine causality here. And the objective is to see whether disclosure motivates people to change their behavior. So we had 3 behavioral economics experiments with real monetary rewards. Advisor and advisees were paired. In the first experiment, we randomized people into disclosure and no disclosure conditions, and all advisors had conflict of interest. And similar to past research in our own paradigm, we replicated that disclosure does indeed backfire. Advisors subject to a conflict of interest give more biased advice with disclosure. They end up with a higher payoff, and advisees end up with a lower payoff. So disclosure is not working very well in that situation. Now, the second experiment was the same. Advisors were randomized into disclosure and no disclosure conditions, but the one key difference was that the advisors had a choice of whether to accept or reject the conflict of interest. And here we found a reversal of the pattern that we found in experiment 1, is that disclosure worked particularly well. Advisors with disclosure were motivated to reject the conflict of interest. They gave significantly less biased advice with disclosure, and advisees were better off. Now, this wasn't economically rational for advisors to reject the conflict of interest. They could have earned more, they could have maximized their payoff if they accepted the conflict of interest. Accepting the conflict of interest gave them a larger reward, but it would risk with disclosure that the advisee would ignore or discount the advice. When we coded the reasons for why advisors accepted or rejected the conflict of interest, we found that most of them weren't saying that they were rejecting the conflict of interest to maximize their payoff. In fact, the majority of them cited ethical reasons. So if we take those reasons at face value, both the ethical or financial reasons motivated them to reject the conflict of interest. And it was almost as if this statement, this disclosure statement, was becoming this vehicle for expressing one's ethics, either to themselves or to other people, that they're trustworthy, they can be cooperative, and people should look at them. Now, the last experiment, we looked at voluntary disclosure compared to mandatory disclosure. And game theory predicts that if people have some adverse information and a credible way of disclosing that information, if they don't disclose it, you should infer the worst. So, for example, if there's a 5-star rating and people will want to disclose that they've gained this 5-star rating, those with 4 stars will also want to disclose it because they don't want to think you've got 3 stars, and so on. You get this unraveling effect. And we found if we made the disclosure and the absence of disclosure salient, we wondered whether voluntary disclosure would work similarly to mandatory disclosure. And that's indeed what we found. We found in this paradigm where disclosure was particularly salient, that voluntary and mandatory disclosure had similar rejection rates of conflicts of interest, and it worked just as well as mandatory disclosure. And in fact, with voluntary disclosure, all those that rejected the conflict of interest, 100% of them all disclosed the absence of conflicts. They were particularly motivated to show that. For those that accepted it, just over half, 55%, also decided to disclose. And this was for a variety of reasons. Some people said it's because of ethical reasons, the advisee's right to know. But there was also a significant minority that said it was because the advisee was going to infer that information in any case, and so they may as well disclose it, which is consistent with the game theory predictions. And some of the field data complements our findings to some extent. As Archon Fung has already mentioned, the LA restaurants were motivated to improve the hygiene in their restaurants to get better ratings. The mandatory marketing costs for prescription drugs in DC led to a downward trend in marketing expenditures by pharmaceutical companies. And voluntary disclosure, there's kind of mixed results. One finding that didn't replicate, didn't complement our lab findings, was that cold openings of movies, that's movies that have no reviews from prior screening, tend to lead to greater box office revenue than openings with negative reviews. And this is really due to limited strategic thinking by moviegoers that don't tend to think that the absence of information means something negative. And that can make it profitable for movie marketers to withhold that information. So when should we have mandatory versus voluntary disclosure? Well, it really depends on how savvy consumers are. My other research shows that consumers tend not to be very savvy. They don't notice missing information unless you're very explicit with it, even when they're comparing profiles next to each other. Unless we say that that particular doctor refused or declined to provide that information, they don't notice if something's missing. But what I think is particularly important is not just how savvy consumers are, but how savvy advisors think consumers are, or companies think consumers are. And if they are also motivated by competition, if they see that as a differentiation tool, that people will come to them because they're unconflicted or they have a 5-star rating, that could be something that also motivates their behavior. And certainly reputational effects are important as well, particularly with conflicts of interest. And this very much depends on social and professional norms. If a particular institutional culture doesn't see anything wrong with a conflict of interest, then disclosure isn't going to work as intended, which is historically the case with the medical profession when they didn't see anything wrong with accepting industry funding. So to summarize, we have some evidence that disclosure can have unintended consequences. On consumers, they can ignore the advice or they can discount erratically. It might even have a halo effect if you have a label. But on advisors, there's also this important moral licensing effect where you see this increased bias in the advice. And that's something that's been mentioned a couple of times today. If you get a 5-star rating on one aspect, what does that mean for other aspects of the business? Would you feel that you've been ethical in this aspect? That leads you to feel that you can be unethical in other aspects of the business. However, there is some optimism that we saw that advisors did choose to avoid conflicts of interest with disclosure. So having something that was very user-friendly or consumer-friendly, this nothing to declare statement, which was very much a quality Q or a 5-star rating, it was very easy for people to interpret. And so advisors were motivated to gain that rating, really tended towards what I think could be a self-calibrating nature of disclosure, in that it motivates the advisors to change their behavior rather than relying on consumers to interpret information and deal with that. So thank you.
So thank you, and thank you for inviting me, and for the very generous introduction. But I have to say, by way of disclosure, I don't think it's merited in this context, because I think of myself as actually a student of both Sunita and Archon's work in coming to understand the role of disclosure in the fields that I care about. But I think I was invited here by NIR because I had some experience with a rating regime that had the kind of effect that NIR is looking for, a rating regime that helped to mobilize or rally a certain kind of movement. So I want to begin by describing that a little bit, and then to build on the work or the learning that I've taken from Archon and Sunita's work to think about some of the skepticism we should bring to disclosure. So about 15 years ago, if you can remember that far back, there was a pretty fierce debate in the context of the internet about the role of copyright in the internet. And this was just at the time of Napster, which of course was born not far from here, and an extraordinary struggle between traditional content owners and the new net, which tended to see copyright as something to be ignored. And in the context of that struggle, the basic framing of the press and people who were reviewing the way the internet functioned was that the net was divided between the kind of pro-copyright people and the anti-copyright people. The kind of people who believed in the vision of all rights reserved, the consequence of which being that to use anything on the internet, you needed to seek out the copyright owner and secure permission. And on the other hand, the people who believed in no rights respected, people who thought copyright was useless and should be ignored, and indeed believed there was an affirmative obligation to violate copyright and spread work as broadly as they could. In that context, there were a number of us at the Berkman Center at Harvard who began to recognize the need for people to be able to assert that they stood between these two extremes. People who believed in copyright and the role of copyright and the need of copyright to facilitate incentives in proper contexts. But on the other hand, people who actually affirmatively believed that they wanted their own work spread easily and broadly. And this middle group, we believed, actually dominated the extremes, yet had no easy way to identify itself or to signal to the world that they considered themselves part of this middle group. So we started an organization called Creative Commons. And what Creative Commons did was give authors or creators a simple way to mark their creativity with the freedoms they intended it to carry. So rather than the traditional all rights reserved associated with copyright, associated with CC, Creative Commons, was a some rights reserved model. Some rights reserved, but a bunch of rights given over to the public, and a mechanism to make these assertions machine readable so it was simple to gather content on the basis of the freedoms that you have to use the content. So for example, I just discovered this to my great embarrassment because I was in front of a Microsoft executive 2 days ago. If you go to the Bing search engine, there is a search engine, it's called Bing, and Microsoft runs it. So if you go to the Bing search engine, you search on images today, you can see a little tag called license, and if you pull down, you can see, you can find images that you're free to use commercially or free to use so long as you give attribution, the full range of permissions that Creative Commons was originally facilitating. And important corners of the net, for example, Wikipedia, build on top of Creative Commons licenses because that's the assertion of the kind of creativity they want to encourage. So this is an example of a rating system that facilitated a separation of an equilibrium. Before it was black and white, and now we understand there's an important space in the middle, and that facilitated a movement of people who wanted to support that middle conception, and over the last decade, that middle section has grown quite dramatically. Now, that's the positives part of the story. But this negative part recognizes, I think, as its first move, which again comes out of the work of Archon and Sunita, that the value of transparency here can't be treated as axiomatic. We can't be kind of Benthamite in our uncritical acceptance of the idea that transparency has a role in all of these contexts, because we have to recognize the particular contingent effect that transparency for a certain kind of field will produce. Related, I think, in part to the underlying facts that are being disclosed and the way those facts will be understood by the public. So for example, in the context of political influence, there's been, of course, an extraordinary transparency movement in the context of politics, both transparency about how much individuals have given to candidates, and more interestingly, transparency about how much lobbying dollars have been spent on particular activities. And the basic motivation for this was, I think, a kind of naive assumption that if we know who gives to what, the public can then rate and weigh support for candidates on the basis of the knowledge they have learned. Without considering whether the public seeing all this produces another effect, which is just greater cynicism and skepticism about the whole project. And indeed, in the context of the lobbying disclosure, one of the consequences of lobbying disclosure has been to produce a new industry among economists to calculate the return on investment from lobbying dollars. And so they're finding returns on investment. One paper from Kansas found a 20,000% return on investment for lobbying dollars spent to get a law changed in a particular way, which fuels the basic cynical perception of Washington that basically every result is up for grabs depending on who's spending what on the money. Now, the conclusion from this is not that we shouldn't have disclosure, but instead that we need a different system for funding elections or funding influence in this context, because a different system wouldn't produce the data that leads us to be cynical or skeptical, and indeed would produce data that gives us reason to have confidence. And in the context of global health, there's a one related example. I just will end with this particular example. That's the labeling around GMO. So I'm sympathetic with the people who are pushing for a broad GMO labeling regime. I'm sympathetic because I understand the skepticism or cynicism people have about the regulatory judgments about GMO, given what I believe is a corrupt political system, so that those who have the interest in good regulations or good regulations have brought those regulations about, and the GMO that's out there then is not necessarily safe. But as someone who's not as skeptical about the ultimate health value of GMO, I'm fearful that this required mandate for disclosure will have the unintended consequence of producing a less healthy food environment for our globe. So once again, like the disclosure and the concept of political transparency, the solution, the remedy here is not to say we shouldn't be disclosing, but it is to say we have an urgent need to increase the reason the public might have to trust the regulatory process that distinguishes between safe or unsafe foods as a function of GMOs. So the disclosure here is forcing, I hope, a more rational regulatory structure, given the kind of view that I think is increasingly sweeping in the political context of disclosure über alles. So thank you very much.
Good. Okay. Okay. I have been invited here to talk about insights from carbon labeling. And I should first say very briefly what carbon labeling means, because I'm coming from a very different community. It isn't really that you're labeling carbon. It's a quantitative indicator of greenhouse gas emissions associated with, in this case, products rather than companies. So global warming footprint typically of a consumer product. Greenhouse gas emissions are aggregated across a number of different types of emissions: carbon dioxide, methane, et cetera, all aggregated into a single metric of carbon dioxide equivalent based on the lifetime global warming potential of each of the gases emitted. And you know, the physical scientists have a reasonable degree of confidence in the exchange rate between these different gases aggregated over time. The estimates are to be aggregated across a product life cycle. So this is from the development of materials, mining, agriculture, or whatever, through production, distribution, use, and disposal. A fairly difficult task. The labels are intended to inform choices by consumers, both individual and organizational consumers of products, and through consumer pressure to influence the producers, the transporters, and the others in the product life cycle. And, you know, it's clear from some of the discussion here, also potentially investors in companies that produce the products. Carbon labeling is still at an early stage of development. Tesco in the UK at one point tried to label every one of the tens of thousands of products on their supermarket shelves, eventually gave up because it was, it's too huge a task. But in looking at this, and this is, the source for this is a paper that I'm co-author on that's in press, in a handbook. I think this slide may have some transferability to today's topic. Principles for selecting products for carbon labeling are, first of all, the magnitude of the footprint. You want to pick a category of product that makes a difference in terms of carbon emissions. The feasibility of assessment of the footprint. There must be adequate data throughout the life cycle in order to support a label that's valid, has some credibility. Thirdly, producer responsiveness or supply-side plasticity. The possibility of the firms that produce the products to adjust their production, acquisition, distribution, or disposal mechanisms in ways that affect the carbon footprint. And consumer responsiveness, demand-side plasticity. If the ultimate consumers, whether they're individuals or organizations, if they want to reduce their carbon footprints, must respond to the labeling program in ways that result in significant decreases. And I should say one of the transferable kinds of issues here, it's clear from the earlier discussion, is that if you can't measure it, you can't maximize it or minimize it. And that's the purpose of all of this. It doesn't mean that you will make decisions in a particular way. That'll depend on the values of the decision maker. But you can't get what you want unless you know whether you're moving in the right direction or not. In the paper, we propose a triage strategy for proceeding. And I think this is also worth thinking about. First, develop labels for products that meet all of the 4 criteria reasonably well. And that's vague, reasonably well. Then proceed to other products, some of which have greater magnitude footprints and therefore theoretically a larger impact. And also a triage approach allows for proof of concept. You can test your methods and measures on some things and learn from that. A few words on possible similarities and differences between the carbon labeling enterprise and the health labeling enterprise. In terms of the magnitude of footprint, with carbon labels, some products are not worth labeling. The impacts are too low. The variation across the producers may be too small, so choices don't affect the footprint. In the health domain, I don't know if you can tell whether there are companies that have health impacts that are below a threshold for labeling. I thought coming into this, are we talking about drug companies? Are we talking about automobile companies, oil companies, financial services companies? Some of these may not have enough of a footprint to matter. Feasibility of assessment, we've heard some things about quality adjusted life years and similar kinds of measurements. And a question that I don't know enough to answer is, are they satisfactory for aggregating across different kinds of diseases, accidents, mental health outcomes, ecological effects on disease vectors, and so on and so forth? I don't know. Aggregating across the product life cycle, there's some potential to do that with carbon through input-output modeling methods that can allocate. I don't know if there's anything analogous in the health area, if you're talking about the impacts cradle to grave of things that companies do. We've heard a lot already, and I won't try to say more about producer and consumer responsiveness. There's been a lot of discussion of that already. And there are a lot of actors who might be important. A few practicality issues. Can valid information be developed? Is the footprint stable for a product? In consumer products, if you have a can of tomato soup, how much does it matter where the tomatoes were purchased? How much does it matter where the purchaser is in relation to the manufacturer and so forth? And there may be analogs, I'm not sure. Can the measurement be done effectively? Can it be done cost effectively? There is the issue that different choices may require different kinds and levels of detail of information. And organizations often can make use of more precise information that only confuses individuals. They may be able to assign somebody to figure it all out, where an individual or a household can't. It's also worth noting the level of precision. We have heard here of seals of approval that, in the measurement world, they talk about nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio scales. So there are nominal scales, it's like a seal of approval. There are ordinal scales like 5-star ratings and A to F letter grades. And then there are ratio scales, which sometimes exist but maybe not here. And there's a principle put up there about labels should convey information that is accurate at the level of precision offered, that users can understand as intended, and that they can act upon given the choices. And I see I have one more slide that I don't have time to talk about, so I'll just put it up there and leave.
On behalf of all of us, I want to extend a word of thanks and appreciation to all our speakers. So the floor is open now for questions. Remember to press your button if you want to ask a question. We will try to aggregate a number of questions if need be, but let's open the floor. You have the floor. Can you just identify yourself, please? And please use a microphone.
I'm Govind Prasad at the Department of Medical Ethics at Penn, and I wanted to ask a question for, in a way, for all the panelists about consumer responsiveness, which is you can have sort of two, it seems to me, broad classes of responsiveness from labeling. One is consumers substitute within the same product type or industry to products that do better in labeling away from ones that do worse. The other is that they substitute across industries or product types into different types where there isn't, say, a labeling regime. So this, in the restaurant case, you can imagine people substituting to A-grade restaurants or going across to grocery stores or cooking food at home themselves. And I'm wondering whether, I guess, A, whether there's empirical work on to what extent one versus the other type of substitution is happening, and more generally, if there are principles. In Professor Lessig's politics case, the worry seems to me to be explicable in the substitution framework, in that with politics, the worry is you could end up with people saying, these folks are all dirty, they all look like they're taking money from conflict of interest causes, so we're just going to substitute out of spending our time on politics entirely and go play World of Warcraft or something. And so, and with carbon, the worry seems less dangerous because it's harder to see how you can substitute out of using carbon. So you just have to, or as it were, substitute out of buying products. It's just that you'll buy products that use carbon better. So I'm wondering if there's empirical work on these kinds of substitution, and then if there are sort of principles about when these kinds of dangers are likely to appear and less likely.
Any other questions at this point? At the back there.
Hi, I'm Lawrence Tai. I'm a fellow at the Center for Ethics. I have a quick question for Archon. You hinted at the environmental NGOs not using the TRI, but I don't think you answered that question. So I was curious if you could follow up on that and then say what the implications are for global health footprint. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to leave it to the panelists to decide who want to go first, and then keep going. Both questions?
Well, maybe I'll just answer Lawrence's, because I think other people probably have lots to say about the product substitution question. So I think it's a really good thing to think about, because oftentimes in disclosure, we're tempted to think about the primary users as at the consumer level. But I think for a bunch of cases, and probably, I don't want to say probably, but perhaps for global health, the primary users of this disclosure information may not be individual consumers, but organizations and advocacy groups and intermediaries of different kinds who have a more intense mission-driven interest in the issue at stake. And for me, the easiest, kind of the starkest comparison for the environmental case is the TRI, Toxics Release Inventory information, compared to Home Mortgage Disclosure Act information, which was a regulation that required banks to disclose the portion of loans that they were making to people of color in inner city communities. It was an anti-redlining transparency effort. And the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act had a huge amount of take-up from community organizations who used that information to do naming and shaming campaigns against banks and to appeal to regulators to enforce the Community Reinvestment Act legislation. And so that's one story of successful take-up of transparency, of disclosure requirement information. And then a less successful story, at least from the advocacy perspective, I think is the TRI. And I think the explanation is that environmental groups, at least in that era, were not tooled up to fight in that way, right? Their main interest, for many of them, was not direct corporate action or naming and shaming of corporations, but advocating for tougher environmental standards in Washington. And on that mission, environmental information was not that much of a help, right? It was information about companies. Their target wasn't primarily companies then. It was another set of entities. It was regulators, right? And so it has to do with the objectives and the capacity of the organizations to utilize the information, right? And I don't know enough about global health advocacy organizations, that is, whether they think of themselves as mainly targeting the Novartises and other producers of the world, or whether they have a different set of capacities and objectives for whom this information would be largely not very well fit to what it is they do.
So I think we can go up one level of generality and say that what we've identified is contexts where the disclosure enables a kind of political action in a way that advances the objective of that certain field. So in the context of Creative Commons, it enabled a political action because it just helped you reveal a group which wanted to push for change along a dimension that otherwise was invisible. In the context of political disclosure, the criticism is that there's not a sensitivity enough to how the simple act of disclosure alone doesn't actually motivate political action. It might motivate, as Mr. Prasad was putting it, the behavior of disengaging. So that's why those of us who criticize in this, not absolute but more subtle way disclosure in the context of political motivation want to say that it's naked transparency that we're against, meaning just the push for transparency, as opposed to people who push for transparency tied to some reform that might actually give people a reason to have hope or faith in the political system again.
I think it's a really good question to figure out what is happening when we have disclosure and how consumers respond, and whether they substitute to the same product type or across industries. And I think we need a lot more research on that particular aspect. Certainly with disclosures of conflicts of interest in the medical context, which is what I've focused on a lot, is that many patients are very confused about these disclosure statements. They don't know how to react to it. And in certain circumstances, even if they trust that statement, even if they trust the statement less or they trust the doctor less, they feel increased pressure to comply with that particular doctor. I also think that it's the most educated consumers, or those that have more choices, that are able to make use of that kind of information and perhaps shift their business elsewhere, which goes back to whether disclosure can actually motivate the providers to change their behavior. And so, for example, with the calorie labeling in restaurants, it might not make consumers consume fewer calories, but it might motivate the restaurants to put lower calorie items on their menus. So we should look at whether providers are also motivated to change their behavior.
Yeah, I would only add, underline the issue that if we get back to the global health context, we're looking at users of information who are not individuals caring about their personal health. They might occasionally be individuals caring about their personal investments if they have enough money to invest to matter, but usually we're talking about organizations, as you said. And that will, we need to do some more thinking about what kinds of information would be useful for them. And there is also the question about, for what purpose do you want to put a number or a seal of approval on a company versus on a product of a company? And that's all. There'll be more questions.
Thank you. Next set of questions. Yourself?
This question is for Larry Lessig, though. And maybe it's a little bit of maybe a stickling point, but I think it's worth trying to be clear about what we're talking about. So I was just, in the case of labeling, it seems to me is a case where you put a label out there and then the consumer is able to promote some other objective by supporting the company that's labeled, or the consumer is able to protect him or herself in a certain way. So with the health labeling in LA, you put the ABC and the consumer can protect themselves, or they can maybe try to promote better hygiene in LA restaurants. But I wasn't sure about the case of the contract, of the sort of the public commons, the use contracts. I mean, I guess like I'm sort of saying the point that it seems more like a contract in that case. You're not really just the companies the organizations that sort of put their information on the internet and they say, well, you can use it in these ways and not in those ways. It's not like they're declaring something about, giving some information about the kind of organization they are, though maybe that's also something that they're doing. It's more like a restaurant putting up a sign that says we're open from 9 to 5. Right? It's an invitation to come at these times, use our restaurant in these ways. Maybe it's an implicit contract sort of saying we accept, we don't have rights to exclude you at these hours, but not in other hours. So it just seemed like it was a little bit, not all forms of disclosure are labeling. Right?
Any other questions at the back there? And there's a microphone on the side.
So this was just a quick question for Sunita. I didn't catch in your results about how having the opportunity to disclose a conflict of interest might cause providers to choose not to engage in conflicts of interest, so they could sort of basically say they had nothing to declare, right? I take it that was sort of one of the findings.
Right.
And I wasn't sure how many of the providers actually opted to do that from your results. So it'd be interesting to sort of hear a little bit about that as well, because that seems like a very interesting result.
May I ask that even though you might have given your name before, please identify yourself for the sake of clips that might be derived from this recording. There is a third question on the side.
This is just more of a general comment that it seems that there are a couple of different things that are being discussed. One is about whether information should be collected and aggregated, whether information should be created, and second, whether there should be a specific signal to consumers that's meaningful and easy for them to understand. So the labeling kind of falls into the second. It often seems to involve the collection of new information, the creation of information about some characteristic or quality of a company. And I'm wondering whether distinguishing between those two is going to be useful and has different implications for policy.
Okay, disclosure is not labeling. Let's hear some more answers.
So thanks for that question, because I think it helps bring out a distinction that I thought had been more clearly stated than I obviously did. So let's take your example of a restaurant that puts up a sign that says we're open 9 to 5. And contrast that with a restaurant in the Deep South in the 1960s that puts up a sign, we serve African Americans. Okay? Those are two very different assertions, even though in one sense they're just describing choices that you have by going to that restaurant. And in the context of the We Serve African Americans restaurant, indicating they're an integrated restaurant, they don't segregate the way most restaurants in the South, or at least a certain class of restaurants in the South in the 1960s did. They facilitate a certain kind of political movement that otherwise is hard to mobilize, right? So in the context of Creative Commons, in a world where you think the population is divided between those who respect copyright and those who oppose it, to stand up and distinguish yourself from the MPAA, in most people's mind, means to associate yourself with the pirates. Right? So you are disinclined to do that if you, in fact, don't believe in the world of the pirates. But if you can create a label that signals there's a space between people who believe that there's an affirmative need to encourage a certain kind of sharing that otherwise is not obviously encouraged, then you give people a place to stand and affirm the need for that kind of behavior that otherwise isn't there. So in the world before something like a Creative Commons movement, it's difficult for educators or scientists to stand up and question the Motion Picture Association because it sounds like they're questioning copyright. But because of this label, you facilitate a political movement that otherwise is more difficult, because now they can say, no, I respect copyright, but I just don't think it should be as extreme as Jack Valenti would view it. And that the collective action problem that type of change facilitates is what the label is aiming for.
Another comment on the disclosure not being equal to labeling issue. What tends to be disclosed, I'll call it data as distinguished from information. Somebody transforms the data into information intended for use by some user. And the whole issue of how much precision you try to put into a label or a rating system or a ranking system or so forth has to do with how you transform the data into information. And I think what we're dealing with in most of these global health applications is users who can handle fairly complex information. And even multidimensional information, if you have ratings on a number of different aspects of global health, sometimes you may want to aggregate them, but if you're talking about users who are sophisticated and have sufficient time and resources to process the information for their purposes, it may be possible to produce information at a fairly high level of, I'll call it precision. I want to distinguish that from accuracy, because you may not be able to get accuracy sometimes. But there really is an issue of how you transform the data that are disclosed voluntarily or otherwise into information that's useful for decision making.
I just wanted to build on that point about the collection of information versus the the issuing of a signal to consumers or whoever it is.
Yeah.
In my view, whether it's global health or many of these other areas, I think that the right way to think about it is as an ecology of information provision and use. And so there's one set of actors, sometimes governmental, but I gather in this domain mostly non-governmental, that are trying to gather the information about companies and what they're doing and maybe what the impacts are, right? And that's important, and I think generally that's very complicated information, and it works best if it's available to everybody, if it's public. And then you get a very different set of organizations disagreeing with one another often about how to make sense of that information. And maybe they're putting together different kinds of labels and signals, or different kinds of interpretations of those data, right? And so earlier today, right, we already had the discussion, a little bit of discussion about the extent to which equity should figure in an approval and a signal. Well, I suppose different organizations in this domain, different actors are going to disagree about that, and that's actually, to my view, a good thing, right? So for financial disclosure in the publicly traded companies, right, what you have is a whole lot of information out there, and then different analysts trying to make sense of that information, coming up with different interpretations, and arguing with one another, or if you like, competing with one another, and I think that's a very healthy thing.
Okay, so to answer the question on how many advisors in the mandatory and voluntary disclosure conditions rejected the conflict of interest, in the first experiment where they had a choice of whether to accept or reject, we had about 65% of advisors in the disclosure condition rejecting it, compared to about 35% in the no disclosure. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, but I can send you the paper. But what's particularly important when you're looking at lab experiments is the differences between the two conditions rather than the absolute percentages, because we randomize people into disclosure, non-disclosure conditions. Those samples should be the same type, and do people behave differently? When we added the voluntary disclosure conditions, so we ran another study with no disclosure, mandatory, and voluntary disclosure, on that sample was more educated than the previous sample. So in that sample, we used as our participants Carnegie Mellon alumni. And in this sample, we got a higher conflict of interest rejection rate across all conditions. So in no disclosure, it was about 60%. With both mandatory and voluntary disclosure, it was around 80%. But again, we're interested, is there a significant difference between no disclosure and the disclosure conditions? And we found that in both experiments. So it seemed as if mandatory and voluntary disclosure were motivating people to reject conflicts of interest. And of course, it's whether people do that in the field depends very much on the culture and the reputation and what they are motivated to reject and why they're motivated to reject it. Even in our experiments, which was a one-off interaction, they indicated that there were both financial and ethical reasons for why they were rejecting the conflict of interest. So it seemed as if, to some extent, disclosure was being used as a tool to display the absence of conflicts.
Thanks very much. Nair has got a question.
This is about the collective action problem that Archon said may be the difference between contexts where things work, like the LA restaurant context, and maybe some of the context that we're talking about here. And I wanted to kind of investigate that a little. So I think what you have in mind is the so-called three-brother problem. So you would think that if we are, compared to situations, my little brother, whom I love, is drowning in a shallow pond. Will I jump in? There's nobody around. Sure, I will. Of course, I don't want to get my kind of tie dirty, but I really love my brother. Of course, I will jump in the water. Now imagine that 10 brothers who all love my brother equally and all know that everybody loves that brother are there. You might think that this will only increase the probability that somebody will jump in for the brother. In fact, depending on how you model it, it might decrease the chance, because each of us, while wanting somebody to do the good ethical job, prefers for it to be somebody else. So when you have an either-or kind of good, and each of us also cares some about buying the cheap product or whatever, they might leave that task to somebody else. And I wonder whether there are not kind of some ways out of this. Instead of answering in theory, I'll talk about the specific example, in the context of the specific example that I mentioned earlier today about rankings for private hospitals in areas of critical health worker shortage for how much they do things to make sure that the attrition for kind of health worker availability in their areas is balanced out by things that they do so that the net impact on public health in India and Thailand, where some of these hospitals operate, remains positive. You might think that the customers, they go there from, say, America, Canada, many other countries, to get cheaper healthcare, would say, look, maybe I understand that there is now this label, it checks whether this hospital is great or not, but I care most about whether I lose money, and there is a lot of money at stake per individual client. Of course, I'll go for savings. But there are some ways to think out of this. First, it's not so clearly an either-or kind of good. You might think, and the hospital that gets a certification may come up with ads that emphasize this point. You might think that the more incentives that we can explain to individual customers, the more incentive there is through many of you being choosing the more ethical hospital, the greater incentive overall there will be for something, public health impact, which is a huge impact overall, much greater than what any of you as individuals may hope otherwise to achieve in their lives. So overall, although your impact on that probability is small, if something happens, and so far as something happens, it's a big thing. You might also think that the advertising hospital that wants to get the customers, or there would be also subsidiary levels that say, and that insurer from the US, they didn't really send their clientele to the certified hospital. Of course, that would come from the competing insurer, or from the company competing against the self-insured company, that they would turn this into a sort of question, not so much about the impact that you don't have so much direct effect on, but rather into what kind of person are you? Are you the kind of pig who wants to get cheap care, and we're telling you here, now you know. This is about maternal mortality and child mortality, and health workers are important for people not dying. Are you the kind of pig who goes there to get cheap care or not? And we know that sometimes in this area of CSR, companies that have managed to translate all of this into a choice about what kind of person are you. For example, the body shop. You buy the ethical soap, and then it kind of you rub your body with a sort of virtue. That seems to kind of work. Maybe they could hope to operate through that more direct impact on the individual rather than. And finally, it's not just individual choice. So yes, when the individual consumer or the individual investor is making the choice, then you have many, many others. But in fact, they come in groups. So the NHS will maybe one day send all their workers, all their citizens, to use medical tourist joints, and for the administrator at the NHS to say, it doesn't cost me much. I can make so many Britons push for something really important. That's actually a very easy choice. You might think that TIA CREF, the person who runs ethical investment at TIA CREF was supposed to speak here today. She couldn't come eventually. They mobilize a lot of investors. For her to make that choice, or for TIA CREF to make that choice, is an easy kind of thing to make. So maybe there are ways out of that collective action problem.
Thanks very much for that exposition. Before we ask the panel to respond to something that they picked up from what Ner had said, I want to see if there are any other questions, because we're coming close to the end of the session. Any other questions, please? Clearly lunch is looming. Let me see, is there any comment that any of the panel members would like to make to what Ner had said?
Yeah, just a quick response to Nir. I think it's a good point, especially your last point about block movers like the NHS who are organized, who are organizations, intermediaries, not individual actors. right? And I think that's why, in point of fact, in a bunch of the transparency and accountability efforts, you see organizations being the main users of information as opposed to more consumer efforts like the LA Restaurant Report Card. It's because it's the organizations that are solving the collective action problem, right? Not all of these individuals. So for the recovery.gov, you see journalists using it, members of, in their capacity as organizational actors, as professionals. You see some advocacy groups. You don't see too many individuals, right? And that's because of the collective action problem. But that was your last point, and all the points up to that were about changing individual consciousness in some way to allow them to act. And I think it's possible. I think it's a question for research about the extent to which that can happen. A very good friend of mine, Dara O'Rourke, is a professor at Berkeley and also a CEO of a startup called Good Guide, which is providing consumers information on products and companies on 3 values. One is health, right? So is your shampoo going to cause you to be sick or your baby to be sick? The second is environmental, and the third is social values. Do they use sweatshop labor, et cetera, right? And so far, he's looking at the data, and he wants help. So other people who are data types should contact Dara, because he's got a huge trove of data from all of this transactional information. But so far, the finding is that people shift their purchasing decisions a fair amount on the health reasons, but not so much on the environment or social, right? And so that just kind of goes back to the collective action kinds of issues, or you don't need to use that framework exactly, but the very self-regarding versus the somewhat other-regarding.
If you take consumer reports, they don't even give you a
Right.
Yeah, just one tiny tweak on that. Your last point, you could distinguish between enabling existing organizations to do what they care about, and facilitating the creation of new organizations that right now can't really exist. And you might think about the way in which the particular kind of label will call into being a certain movement or set of organizations that don't otherwise exist, or sustain them. So you think about ProPublica, which is an organization funding investigative journalist research in the face of collapsing investigative journalism in the marketplace, because newspapers can't afford that anymore. This is they're solving a collective action problem around investigative journalists to sustain or to bring back to life a certain type of information in newspapers. But all of it's aware or sensitive to the dynamic ability of certain kind of activity or mobilization to continue to survive in the context of changing environment.
I'd just like to add, one more little tweak about organizational intermediaries solving the collective action problem. One of the things that they do is help solve the collective action problem by being big. But another thing that they do that's also important is to solve the information cost problem. For little guys, they don't have the time or the resources to sort through all of the data and make them into decision-relevant information, but organizations can do that for little guys.
I agree, and one example is the American Association of Medical Students scorecard that actually grades academic medical centres from A to F on how strong their conflict of interest policies are. They previously didn't have that role. They took it on, and it's meant that this is voluntary disclosure, and academic medical centres submit their conflict of interest policies to the AAMS in order to be evaluated, and it's really motivated them to generate stronger conflict of interest policies due to this grading that they're going to get. So that institution, patients may not be looking at it, but other people are.
Well, on behalf of everyone, let me express our sincere appreciation to the panelists and to all of you who have listened and participated with questions. We have now finished session 3 or panel 3. If everyone can make their way to the second floor for lunch, and then we will reconvene here in this space promptly at 1:30 for a lecture by Wahid Hussain from the Wharton School. Thank you very much.